This is Dr. James Strickler, and this lecture addresses Chapter 7, The Early Republic, in the United States history textbook, American Yawp. This chapter is dealing with the events in the former colonies in the period shortly after they had formed the new nation, the United States of America. And we're going to begin discussing this time period by looking at how the founding group of people dealt with other groups as they saw it, that lived within the same country as them. And the first of those groups were the slaves. This is a time of great tension between the slave population and the white population in America. This tension existed because a revolution had taken place on a Caribbean island. On that Caribbean island, there was the nation of Haiti, and they had an extremely large slave population there that rose up over about a decade-long period and fought a war against the white masters and eventually defeated them and took over the island. It became the first country in the Western Hemisphere with a black ruling class over it. Well, this revolution by the slaves in Haiti inspired the slaves within America to think that maybe they could revolt and get their freedom too. And this created great terror in the white majority, that the slaves would rise up and violently confront them. An example of this was an event that became known as Gabriels Rebellion. What happened in Gabriels Rebellion was that a group of up to 1,000 slaves had formed a plot to attack the state capitol in Richmond, Virginia, take the governor hostage, and use that as a bargaining chip to get slavery ended in Virginia. Well, they had to postpone the day of their scheduled attack, and as a result of that, some of the potential participants ended up having loose lips. They told people about what they had planned. The word spread. Eventually, the state government found out about it, and they intervened and arrested Gabriel and some of his top generals, you might describe them, and 26 of them were executed. And this ended Gabriel's rebellion, but it seemed to confirm the worst fears of the white majority. To battle against these potential slave uprisings, one of the tactics that was used by the white majority was to criticize their possibility. Now, that may not seem like an obvious way to do this, but remember that for a group like the slaves to rise up, they had to have a certain confidence in their ability. And at the same time, they didn't want the white majority walking around in fear. So one of the ways to deal with this is with propaganda that both convinces the white majority that everything's going to be okay, this isn't going to happen, you can go about your lives without living in fear, but also convinces the slave population that they are not capable of doing this thing. And so here's an example of this. These were called Bobolition broadsides. And that word Bobolition is a play on the word abolition. And what was being done here was it was mocking the slaves, claiming that they couldn't even pronounce the word correctly, much less achieve it. And so this kind of attitude was common, and this sort of propaganda was common during this time period to deal with this fear that was percolating in society. Another way that they potentially dealt with it was by organizing groups to try to send the slaves back to Africa. There was a recognition among some of the people at this time, or I should say a belief, that these two groups could never coexist peacefully together. The only way to deal with it was separation. And the best way to do that was to simply repatriate blacks back to Africa. That's how the country of Liberia was founded in Africa. The American Colonization Society was a group that was set up specifically to try to organize the movement of slaves back to Africa. Now, this wasn't universally accepted, though, as a good idea. You got to understand that many of these slaves were generations away from Africa, that not only had they been born and raised in America, but their parents had been, even their grandparents. They knew no other life. And so the idea of crossing an ocean to an unfamiliar continent, even if that's where their ancestors came from, did not seem like an acceptable solution to them. And so this was something that some people tried, some people accepted, some former slaves went, but it was not a universally accepted idea. Another group, another group that the white majority had to deal with was Native Americans. Remember that as the white population spread, that the native groups had oftentimes been, matter of fact, almost universally been reduced in size and power by the diseases that went ahead. But nonetheless, they remained. And they remained in a diminished state, a less powerful state. And so they had developed mechanisms for dealing with the white majority. Among these mechanisms was something called the playoff system. Okay, now don't think about playoff like in sports, like NBA playoffs in basketball. That isn't what is meant here. What is meant here is playing off one group against another. So, the Native American population had been pushed to the frontier of what was this burgeoning new country, the United States of America. And that put them between the Americans and the French. And they had taken advantage of this to play the two groups against each other to try to maintain their own power. So the way this works then is they talk to the French and they say, the English are coming, and we will help you hold them off if you will be our allies and protect us from them, and potentially vice versa, although it was more often them siding with the French. They were caught in the middle, and they tried to assume this role as a buffer between the two groups, and by doing that, they hoped to maintain their own land. To do this, they entered into confederations, where various tribes that historically had not really cooperated with each other now had a common enemy, the Americans that were encroaching upon their territory, that they could then use to create unity among them. So these groups, which historically had had conflict with each other, are now united to try to stop the white people from moving into their areas. An example of this was called the Western Confederacy. It existed in what is now the Midwestern United States, states like Illinois and Wisconsin and Michigan and places like that. And these various tribes that either historically had been there or had been pushed there by white settlement now organized together to try to stand up against the continually encroaching white settlers. But this ended up being a failure. The whites were better armed, and they were better organized, and they ended up in pitched battles, such as the Battle of Fallen Timbers, where the Western Confederacy was defeated, broken apart. Well, this isn't the only example of this kind of thing happening. This happened over and over again, that when the native population tried to stand up, they would end up eventually defeated militarily by the whites. Another example was the Tecumseh Confederation. Tecumseh and his brother, Tenskwatawa, I'm not sure if I pronounced that right, were members of the Shawnee tribe. The brother was seen as a prophet, as a great spiritual leader, while Tecumseh was more of a military leader. Together they tried to organize a giant confederation of native tribes stretching all the way from Canada to Georgia. Well, their efforts were not always successful. When they went south to try to get members from what is now the southern United States, they only had limited success. But even as they got tribes to join in this confederation, again, they were not in a position militarily to stand up against the whites. This Tecumseh Federation was defeated finally in the Battle of Tippecanoe in 1811. This was fought in an area of what is today Indiana. Now this battle is important for two reasons. One is that it ended this conflict between the Tecumseh Federation. They were defeated, they were subjugated. Now, this didn't mean that all struggle disappeared, but this idea of them all banding together to stand up against the whites and prevent their movement west, that was ended at Tippecanoe. That's one important thing. But the other is that the big military hero of this battle, the general that led the American army to defeat this native confederation, was a man named William Henry Harrison. And he would later on parlay that fame that he got from this battle into a run for the presidency of the United States. Another big battle in this conflict took place in the South, in what is now Alabama. The only Southern tribe that agreed to join this Tecumseh Federation to stand up against the whites was the Red Stick Creeks. And Andrew Jackson, a Indian fighting frontiersman from Kentucky, was leader of this battle for the American army. He defeated the Red Stick Creeks, along with some allies from other tribes that had conflicts with the Red Sticks. They were called Red Sticks because they carried around these club weapons that have been dyed red. Okay, but anyway, the point is that he defeated them at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend. And this was the beginning of the fame of Andrew Jackson as an Indian fighter. He would go on to do other things shortly thereafter, and like in the case of William Henry Harrison, he would use this fame that he gained from these battles to help him eventually pursue the presidency of the United States. In addition to this new country figuring out how they would deal with other groups within their borders, they also had to figure out how they would actually deal with themselves. What sort of society, particularly political society, they would build. What sort of political system they would have within the confines of this new constitution. One of the ways that they changed during this time period was an embracing of what we call Republicanism. Now, you have to be careful when we say Republicanism here. We are not necessarily meaning the political party. There was a political party at this time that took that name. It's not the same as the Republican Party today, but we're more talking about a principle. It's a principle of devolving power down to the hands of the people, rather than leaving it in the hands of a small elite group of rich people who are big landowners and merchants and things like that. Instead, you try to get more common people involved in the political process. And one of the ways you do this is by easing requirements for voting. We still see that today as there are ongoing conflicts about voting rules, even in America in the 2020s. But at this time, the big conflict was that there were rules that a voter had to own property in order to be allowed to vote. I should say a potential voter had to own property. The reason for this was they wanted people voting who had demonstrated that they had a certain commitment to the community, that they had achieved a level of responsibility in their lives that allowed them to have these sorts of possessions. It was a way of looking at voting that people that were less educated, more ignorant, things like that, really shouldn't participate in the process. So we need to have some way to screen them out, and one of the ways is we're going to only allow the property owners who are more likely to have those skills to make wise choices. Well, some groups thought that that was discriminatory against the people who were really the heart of where the power of government comes from. This is a founding philosophy of America. And so they wanted to ease those requirements to allow more people to participate in this process. Now, of course, there was a political motive. The political party that was most interested in easing the voting requirements to get these people in the process believed that they would mostly be voters for that political party, and that we still see that sort of thing in America today. Those who tend to want to make voting easier want to do so because they believe the votes that they pick up from that will be for them. Another development in this idea of creating a political culture in this new country was a notion called Republican motherhood. So remember, Republicanism is this idea that the people are in charge of the country and the power should rest in their hands. But there's this concern about whether or not they have the skills to properly wield that power. Do they have the knowledge? Do they have the wisdom to do so? And so a way to try to instill that knowledge and wisdom in them was to view mothers, who were the primary ones in charge of raising the children, as having a special role to teach these virtues to their children. This was something that was talked about in society. It was encouraged in society for mothers in their homes to teach their children to be good, responsible citizens. An outgrowth of this Republican movement was Thomas Jefferson getting elected President of the United States. Now, we've previously mentioned this, that Jefferson was elected during the election of 1800. This was in some ways called a revolution, because the Federalist Party that had been the ones behind the American formation of the United States of America had been forced out of power by the Republicans. And it had been over this question of just how powerful the government should be, just what kind of people should be in charge of it. And Jefferson took advantage of fears of things, for example, the Alien and Sedition Acts, and appeals to the people about giving power to them to win the presidency. After he won the presidency, then he tried to act upon these ideals by cutting taxes and reducing the size of government. The notion behind this is to return power back to the people, to give them more opportunities, more freedoms for common citizens to use their money the way they would want, to engage in the kind of business they want, rather than the government dictating the rules, the government taking their money in taxes and doing with it what they want instead. This is a theme that has existed throughout American history. You'll see it in other places, like, for example, during the presidency of Ronald Reagan in the 1980s, or the presidency of Donald Trump. These are presidents that came to office saying that they wanted to do these same sorts of things. Like I said, it's been a theme throughout American history. The opposition to it is there's usually another political party that says, no, we need bigger, stronger government to do more things for people, to raise more taxes from the wealthy, to pay for more programs for people. So this has been a constant tension politically through American history. And during this time period, it was Thomas Jefferson and his Republican Party that was on the side of smaller government and reduced taxes. Now, part of this philosophy of Thomas Jefferson, which we saw previously when we talked in another chapter about George Washington deciding whether or not to have the first Bank of the United States, was this notion that the government should be limited to its constitutional powers. You may remember when we discussed the Bank of the United States that on one side you had Alexander Hamilton that wanted to loosely interpret the Constitution so the government could do more and more and more things, while there was Thomas Jefferson who said, no, we should strictly interpret it, keep the government within its enumerated powers. Well, Jefferson was then faced with a moment in his presidency where he had to decide whether or not to do just what he believed was best for the country or stick to the strict reading of the Constitution. And that happened when France offered to sell its Louisiana territory to Jefferson for $15 million, which was a steal. Now, just talk a little bit about the history here of Louisiana. This is an area that was originally claimed and settled by France, which then they lost to Spain during a war. Spain briefly possessed it. But then during the wars following the French Revolution, when Napoleon came to power in France, they defeated Spain, and as part of the terms of it, they got this territory back. But Napoleon was concerned about the wars in Europe. He didn't really want to be dealing with this kind of thing in America. So he offered to sell this territory for cheap to the United States. And Jefferson felt like he just had to grab the deal. So he accepted the deal, arranged to pay the money, even though it's constitutionally questionable whether or not a president can even do such a thing. This shows how sometimes political ideals can be compromised in the heat of the moment of what is actually happening in the political world. So when Jefferson came into power, one of the conflicts that existed between the Federalists, who he defeated, and the Republicans, who he was the leader of, was over who they would have a relationship with in Europe. Would they be more sided with the English or more sided with the French? And the countries of Britain, again, I've told you before that during these lectures I'll oftentimes use the terms England and Britain and that interchangeably. We're talking about the same group here. Were at war during this time period. And the British felt that the Americans were siding with the French. And so what they decided to do was to require any American ships that were trying to transit the Atlantic and eventually get to France to sell them goods that might help the French in their war against the British, would be forced to first make port in England and pay what they called a transit fee or a transit duty. This is a way to discourage trade with France. So these English ships would spot American ships on the Atlantic. They would force them into port in England and force them to essentially pay a tax before they could move on to France. This was a way to discourage American trade with France. The Americans obviously did not like this, that the British were forcing them to go through England and pay a tax to England. So, as a way to deal with this then, the United States of America put in place a new law called the Embargo Act, in which they refused to allow any foreign traders to come into their ports, whether it be French or English. The idea was to assert American neutrality, to say, look, we aren't on either side here. We really don't want to get in the middle of your war. And the way we're going to do that is we're not going to trade with either of you. Well, as we've talked before, there's a history in America of American consumers and merchants trying to avoid these things through smuggling, etc. But it was viewed as a way during this time period to assert neutrality in this conflict, not get involved in this European war. Well, a response to this from the English was to engage in a practice called impressment. Excuse me. Impressment was when British warships would encounter American ships on the Atlantic Ocean. They would not just potentially seize the ship, but they would seize the sailors off of the ship and force them to then serve on British ships in their war with France. They were basically forcibly drafting Americans to fight for them in their war. This escalated the conflict between the United States and England, and it will eventually break out into full-on war. But that would come later, after the presidency of Thomas Jefferson. But this Embargo Act that they had put in place, which accelerated the conflict between them and England, had a devastating effect upon the American economy. Economies are built on trade. That's the basic economics of it, is that you take products that you can make better or cheaper, you sell them to other people, you buy things from them that they can make better or cheaper. Well, when that trade can't take place, what happens is economic recession or even a depression. And America had been struggling economically since its founding. In the aftermath of the American Revolution, there was an economic recession, and here just a few days later, there's another one. Few years later, there's another one. America hasn't quite been able to assert itself as an economic power yet. But for them at this time, the politics of standing independently, not being forced by England or France to go along with what they want, was more important. So even though Jefferson led this sort of disastrous economic policy of embargo, he finished his presidency not hated by the American people, because this idea of we are our own independent people, we are standing by ourselves without taking sides, was even more important. But the conflict with England would continue to escalate until open war took place. and this became known as the War of 1812. As the conflict escalated, a couple of members of the United States Congress became the leaders in the war movement. They became known as war hawks. They were the people that aggressively wanted to assert the might of the United States in this conflict with England and just go to war with them. One of these was a man named John C. Calhoun from South Carolina. The other was Henry Clay from Kentucky. Well, Calhoun and Clay and others were eventually successful in convincing James Madison, who had become president after Thomas Jefferson, that it was necessary to go to war with England to stop them from abusing Americans on the Atlantic Ocean. So remember, it's really important to do trade or your economy suffers. And American ships are leaving American ports going out to engage in trade, even with other countries besides France and England. And as they go out there, British ships are attacking the American ships, seizing cargo, seizing sailors, impressing them, things like that. And so the Warhawks eventually convinced James Madison that this has to be ended, and the only way we're going to end it is to stand up against the might of England and smack them down and make them stop that way. As America went to war, the big slogan that was used to kind of inspire people that we need to do this was free trade and sailors' rights. Now notice the two issues being talked about here, the ones that really led them to war. One is free trade. We need to be able to go out and trade with the world or our economy suffers, and England is stopping us from doing this by forcing our ships into English ports and requiring a transit fee. And sailors' rights, that England is violating the rights of Americans who are sailors out in the high seas by seizing them and drafting them to be sailors in England's fights with France. So this became the big issue. This is what was used to justify the War of 1812. So a great part of this war then was a naval war, since that was really about the relationship on the oceans. An important battle in this that was very inspiring for the American people was a battle between a British ship, the HMS, that stands for Her Majesty's ship, or His Majesty's ship if it's a king, Guerriere, and the United States Constitution. The United States Constitution won this battle when the cannon fire from the British ship bounced off of the sides of the American ship rather than destroying it. This then led the American ship, the USS Constitution, to be nicknamed Old Ironsides. And this became an iconic ship in the American Navy. It is still a commissioned ship in the American Navy today. There are sailors who literally sail it around as a United States warship. Now, it's just symbolic. It couldn't really fight in our wars today. But it shows how a symbol like this during a time of war can be so important. America had a ship that could stand up against the best that the British had and defeat them. While America had victories like of Old Ironsides out on the Atlantic, for the most part the British were winning the war there. But the Americans had an advantage on the interior. You got to understand that the American country bordered on the Great Lakes. The Great Lakes are huge enough that you can have navies operate there. And England still controlled Canada. So there was a British Navy upon the Great Lakes, and there was an American Navy on the Great Lakes. So the battle between these navies didn't just take place out on the ocean, it also took place on these lakes. And at the Battle of Lake Erie in 1813, the American Navy defeated the British Navy on the Great Lakes and took control of them. Now this was a big deal because this showed that America could stand up against the British Navy, but it also then freed resources to go elsewhere because the British had been defeated here. Although America won the naval battle on the interior, the battle out in the Atlantic was still ongoing. And a point of this battle was for the British eventually to get control of the Atlantic and be able to land sufficient troops in America to then have a land invasion and defeat America that way. There were some people in England that even thought this would lead to the colonies being restored back as part of the British Empire. So one of the things that they did in this was the Battle of Baltimore, where the British Navy came into Baltimore Harbor to try to seize that area as a place where they could then land troops. This battle then took place around a fort at the edge of the harbor called Fort McHenry. And the United States, miraculously, it would seem, was able to preserve Fort McHenry in this battle. And this delayed the British eventually being able to get troops landed. They would eventually, as we'll talk about in just a moment. But the important thing to come out of this battle was there was an observer there among the Americans, a man named Francis Scott Key, who he watched the assault from the British ships on the American Fort McHenry through the night. And that in the morning he could see that the American flag was still flying over the fort, showing that they had not been defeated. And inspired by this, he wrote a poem called the Star-Spangled Banner, which was eventually put to music, which became the national anthem of the United States. It was born out of this struggle with England in the War of 1812 and showed that we could take their best punches and still remain standing. Well, things didn't always go well during this war. The British were able to land troops. They marched through the heart of America. They assaulted Washington, D.C. The town had to be evacuated. The British burned the White House. And so the war was very much up in the air. There were victories for the Americans, like on the Great Lakes. There were victories for the British, like the burning of the White House. During this conflict, remember that the Federalists had always had a desire to be allied with England, while the Republicans, who were in power, had always been more likely to be allied with France. Well, the Federalists thought that this war was nonsense, that they should just make peace with England. And so they held a convention in Hartford, Connecticut to talk about ways to get out of this conflict. And one of the issues that surrounded this convention was a possibility of whether or not the northern states in New England and that were primarily controlled by Federalists would actually secede from the Union. Remember, the country's only been around for a few decades now, and there's already talk of it breaking up. Now, the actual people who attended the convention did not give serious discussion about this idea of them leaving the country. But it was an idea that surrounded the convention that was widely reported. And it caused the Republicans to claim that the Federalists were not true patriots, that they didn't want to be part of America, and therefore, politically, they should be defeated to preserve the Union. Well, despite these discussions, I should say these disagreements within the country of the United States itself about how to best handle the War of 1812 and how best to handle relationships with England, eventually the war petered out. The British decided that they weren't getting enough gain for the resources they were using, and a treaty was signed between the United States and England ending the War of 1812. This was the Treaty of Ghent. Now notice the date of the treaty, 1814. Communications was more difficult back then. So even as these countries ended their conflict, it took a while for the news of that to actually spread to all the places where the fighting was happening. One of those places was New Orleans. The British had decided another place where they could potentially invade America was through the port of New Orleans on the Mississippi River. And so they sent a detachment of ships there and soldiers to attack New Orleans. And the battle actually took place after the treaty had been signed ending the war. Well, Andrew Jackson, the Indian fighter, the hero of the Battle of the Horseshoe Bend, was the general in charge of the American troops in New Orleans. He led the defense of the city. And in a surprising upset, the Americans defeated this invading British army in New Orleans. And through that, Andrew Jackson became a national hero. Again, you got to remember this is a young country, and it's looking for reasons to be confident in itself. And here they have fought a pitched battle against arguably the most powerful country in the world at the time, and they've defeated them in places like the Great Lakes. They defeated them in places like New Orleans. They eventually forced them to sign a treaty which now and forever will recognize the United States as an independent country, that the British are never going to come and take over again. This was important stuff for the people of the United States at the time. In the aftermath of the War of 1812, the focus then turns to trying to improve this country that they have now secured. And this improvement idea gave birth to a political set of programs called the American system. The American system was championed by the same people who had championed the war. John C. Calhoun from South Carolina and Henry Clay from Kentucky. Now, interestingly, John C. Calhoun eventually changes his mind about this, but at least initially they're the ones that are the leaders of creating it. Now, again, the idea of them being behind this is these are people that believe in the power of America and they want it to assert itself. In the War of 1812, they want to see America assert its power by defeating the English so the English would leave our sailors alone on the high seas and let us engage in free trade. Now they want to assert the power of America by seeing it build an infrastructure system that will allow it to expand and grow economically. So, a big part of the American system was creating a system of internal improvements, they call them. These are roads being built, bridges being built, canals being dug to connect the country together and allow free trade to happen. Another part of the American system was the creation of a second Bank of the United States. Now, I already previously referred in this lecture to the debate over the first Bank of the United States between Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton, and how that was settled with the creation of the first Bank of the United States under George Washington's blessing. Well, that bank existed for a limited time period. And so once it had expired, there was still this idea that maybe we need a central bank to loan money to people to help the economy. And so the Second Bank of the United States was created in 1816 as part of this American system. Now, this is going to come up later on, more importantly, but I'll just mention it now. John C. Calhoun, one of the original proponents of this system, eventually turned against it. And the reason was because of this basic argument that goes back to Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson. John C. Calhoun originally thought these were good ideas, but as he thought about them more, he decided that they were unconstitutional ideas, that he was asking the government of the United States to do things that it had not been constitutionally authorized to do. And this belief of his that the United States should stick to the things that it has been constitutionally assigned to do ends up influencing his politics later on as we move on to other issues in the country that will come up in later lectures, when John C. Calhoun will be an important figure in American history. But this is the moment of sort of transition for him. Well, in the aftermath of the War of 1812 and these expansive projects of the American system, the United States gains this great confidence in itself that we're talking about, and the economy begins to boom. This became known as the era of good feelings. And the people that were held as the responsible parties for the era of good feelings, the ones that had brought this boom time to America, were the Republicans, the Republican Party of Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. Well, the sort of peak of this happens when James Monroe, another politician for Virginia like Madison and Jefferson, runs for president, and he is actually unopposed. There isn't even anybody else on the ballot. By this point, the Federalist Party has been completely defeated. The Republican Party runs the country, so much so that their presidential candidate doesn't even face another candidate and wins unanimously. Well, nearly unanimously. When the Electoral College met to vote, What happened was a single elector refused to vote for James Monroe because he wanted George Washington to be the only president ever unanimously elected. So, by 1820, the United States essentially has a one-party system. While the Federalists sort of had a candidate for president, not really, James Monroe sweeps the country, wins everything. The Federalist Party has been destroyed at this point. Now, eventually we'll see somebody else come up in their place. But for a brief time in American history, we have a one-party system because the Republican Party had been so successful in the War of 1812 and this American system that they created. While James Monroe is president, he then puts forth a policy called the Monroe Doctrine, which is another important thing in American history. Essentially what he asserts is that the Western Hemisphere, North and South America, are now off limits to European powers. Now, not entirely off limits. The things that European powers already have here, he's not going to try to go to war with them and drive them out. But he asserts that they cannot come to this area and create any new colonies, that they should stay out of the Western Hemisphere's affairs. Now, this is an ideal that America isn't really powerful enough to assert and force on these other countries. But it becomes an American ideal, and as American power grows, eventually they are able to assert it. So at the end of this period that we're talking about here in this lecture, this time in America in the early republic when the United States is sort of growing into the country that they formed at the Constitutional Convention. At the end of this period, the country has vastly multiplied in size as we've grabbed the territory of Louisiana from France. We have Americans even going to the west coast to the Oregon Territory that we're jointly occupying with England. We have picked up territory from Spain, like Florida. The United States has defeated the Native American tribes on the frontier, and a group of new states have been quickly added, where by 1824, you don't just have the 13 original states, but you now have 24 states. The country is vastly increased in size, vastly increased in confidence, vastly increased in power during this time period. It's on its road to becoming the preeminent power in the world. And that ends this lecture for Chapter 7.